The dust coated everything, a fine, gritty veil over the faces of the weary and the curious alike. Sarah pulled the tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders, the thin fabric offering no real warmth against the chill wind that swept across the makeshift auction square. Her eyes, sunken with exhaustion and unshed tears, scanned the indifferent faces in the small crowd. 12 children huddled close, their small bodies pressed against her skirts, silent save for the occasional whimper from the youngest. Inside her, another life stirred, a painful reminder of the husband lost to fever and the cruel turn of fortune that had brought them to this ignominious place. They were chattel now, their fate to be decided by the highest bid. Humiliation burned hotter than the setting sun. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like grinding stones and eyes that held no kindness, cleared his throat. Next up, Sarah Miller, widow, 34 years of age, sound health, and her brood of, let's see, a baker's dozen near enough with another on the way. Strong hands here, folk, potential for labor, especially the older ones. He gestured vaguely towards the children, whose eyes widened in terror. Sarah's breath hitched. The stares felt like physical blows. Whispers snaked through the crowd. Too many mouths to feed. Trouble, no man wants that kind of burden. Despair threatened to swallow her whole. How could she protect them? How could they survive this? She squeezed the hand of her eldest daughter, Alara, a girl of 12 who met her gaze with a bravery Sarah didn't feel. The bidding began, a low rumble of figures that seemed impossibly small, reflecting the collective assessment of their worth. Negligible. Faces blurred. A rancher scoffed. A merchant shook his head. No one wanted the impossible burden of a pregnant widow and 12 fatherless children. The bids stalled. The auctioneer looked ready to declare them unsold, perhaps to be split up, scattered to different indifferent masters, a fate Sarah couldn't bear to contemplate. Just as the hammer poised to fall, a voice cut through the murmur, deep and resonant. $50, all heads turned. The man who had spoken stood slightly apart from the main crowd, a solitary figure in worn but clean clothes. He was tall, lean, with a weather-beaten face framed by dark, unruly hair and eyes that seemed to hold the stillness of distant mountains. Elias Thorne, a man of mystery, a recluse who lived alone on a remote claim north of town. He rarely came to settlements, spoke to few. Why would he? The auctioneer blinked, surprised.
$50.
Thorne bids 50. Any advance. Silence. The crowd stared at Elias, then back at Sarah and the children, a mixture of confusion and suspicion on their faces. $50 was a paltry sum, barely enough to cover the auction fees, certainly not the market value of anything, let alone 13 souls. The hammer fell. Sold. To Elias Thorne.
$50.
Sarah's knees buckled. Sold. To this stranger, this solitary man who lived in isolation. Fear, sharp and cold, replaced despair. What horrors awaited them now? He approached slowly, his gaze meeting Sarah's for just a moment. There was no cruelty in his eyes, but no warmth either. Just a profound, unreadable stillness. He nodded curtly to the auctioneer, paid the fee, and then turned to them. "Gather your things," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We leave now." Their things were pitifully few. A couple of worn blankets, a pot, a few salvaged clothes stuffed into sacks. The children, wide-eyed and silent, clung closer to Sarah as Elias waited patiently, saying nothing more. The journey north was long and silent. They rode in his wagon, piled amongst sacks of feed and tools. The younger children cried softly from hunger and fear, but Elias drove on, his back straight, eyes fixed on the horizon. Sarah watched him, trying to decipher the enigma he represented. Was he a savior or something worse? His profile was hard, his movements economical. He offered no conversation, no reassurances. The sun dipped below the plains, casting long, eerie shadows. The isolation of their surroundings grew with every mile. Sarah held her children close, the fear a constant, heavy weight in her chest. Her future, their future, was entirely in the hands of this silent, solitary man they knew nothing about. The night was cold, the stars vast and indifferent. They stopped by a small creek. Elias built a fire efficiently, boiled coffee for himself, and offered Sarah some water and hardtack. It was the first interaction beyond simple instruction. She took it gratefully, her hands trembling. The children were given a small piece of the hardtack each. It wasn't much, but it was more than she'd expected. As the children huddled together under blankets, eventually drifting into uneasy sleep, Sarah remained awake, watching Elias. He sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He didn't look at them. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackling fire and the sounds of the night. It was a silence filled with uncertainty, with unspoken questions and profound anxiety. Who was this man and why had he bought them? The questions echoed in the vast, dark expanse of the western night. Their arrival at Elias Thorne's homestead was not to a grand ranch, but a modest, sturdy cabin nestled in a valley overlooked by rugged hills. It was small, clean, built of thick logs, with a corral, a small barn, and a well. Spartan, functional. There was no sign of excess, no pretense. The children, initially apprehensive, peered out from the wagon, their fear momentarily replaced by cautious curiosity. Elias wordlessly indicated where they should put their meager belongings. A small lean-to attached to the cabin, empty but dry. It was cramped for 13, soon to be 14, but it was shelter. He showed Sarah the well, the outhouse, the small root cellar. His instructions were brief, direct. Water here. Woodpile needs replenishing daily. I hunt for meat. You manage the rest. The rest felt monumental, feeding and caring for her large family in this unfamiliar place, under the silent gaze of their owner. Sarah's pride smarted at the term, but she swallowed it down. Survival came first. Days bled into weeks. A strange rhythm settled over their lives. Elias worked the land from dawn till dusk, tending a small patch of crops Sarah hadn't noticed initially, fixing fences, hunting. He was a man of constant, quiet labor. He brought back game, rabbit, deer, and left it for Sarah to prepare. He provided flour, beans, salt, sugar, basic but sufficient supplies bought with the few funds he seemed to possess. He never ate with them, taking his meals alone by the fire outside or inside the cabin if the weather was poor. He spoke only when necessary, issuing instructions or answering a direct question with minimal words. Sarah, driven by the need to provide for her children and perhaps a simmering defiance against her circumstances, organized their lives. The older children helped with chores, fetching water, gathering wood, tending a small garden plot Sarah started with seeds Elias provided. The younger ones helped as they could, or played quietly under the watchful eyes of their siblings. Sarah cooked, cleaned, mended clothes with thread and needles Elias somehow produced. She was constantly busy, physically exhausted, but the work was a distraction from the gnawing fear and the questions that circled her mind. Elias Thorne remained an enigma. He wasn't cruel. He didn't beat them, didn't shout. He simply existed alongside them, a silent, watchful presence. He never intruded on their space in the lean-to. He never commented on the children, though Sarah sometimes caught him watching them from a distance, Alara helping the younger ones. Young Thomas trying to mimic his movements as he chopped wood. His expression was unreadable. Was it annoyance? Tolerance? Sarah couldn't tell. Her initial terror began to give way to a cautious observation. He was a hard man, shaped by a hard land, but his hardness seemed directed outwards, at the wilderness, at the struggle for survival, not inwards, at them. He was reliable in providing the necessities. He expected work in return, but it was fair work, the kind needed to keep a place running. It was not the exploitative servitude she had feared. One evening, a fierce storm rolled in, the wind howling like a banshee, rain lashing against the cabin. The lean-to, while sturdy, felt vulnerable. The younger children whimpered with fear. Elias opened the cabin door. "Come in," he said, his voice barely audible above the storm. "You'll be warmer." Sarah hesitated for a moment, her pride warring with her need to comfort her children. She gathered them quickly, leading them into the main cabin. It was Spartan inside, a fireplace, a table, a few chairs, a bunk. But it was dry, warm, and solid. They huddled near the fire, wrapped in blankets. Elias sat across the room, cleaning his rifle, his back to them. The silence was less tense than before, filled only by the roar of the storm and the crackling fire. Sarah watched him, a new layer added to her assessment. He wasn't heartless. A tentative seed of something other than fear began to sprout in her heart. Something akin to bewildered gratitude. She still didn't understand his motives, but for the first time since the auction block, she felt a fragile sense of safety. They were unwelcome guests in his solitary life, a disruption he had paid for, yet he offered them shelter from the storm, literal and perhaps figurative. The mystery of Elias Thorne deepened, but the edges of her fear began to soften, replaced by a cautious hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they hadn't been bought for ruin. Months turned into a year. The baby was born, a healthy boy Sarah named Daniel, in the small, warm cabin with only Alara and Elias for assistants. Elias had been quiet but competent, fetching water, heating cloths, his presence a steady, non-anxious anchor in the pain and vulnerability of childbirth. It was a shared intimacy born of necessity, unlike any she had known since her husband's death. After Daniel's arrival, something subtle shifted. Elias didn't become garrulous, but his silence felt less like distance and more like quiet companionship. He still ate separately, still spoke few words, but his observations of them grew more apparent. He'd leave a particularly good cut of meat where Sarah would find it easily, repair a child's broken toy without being asked, or show Thomas how to properly hold an axe. He taught the older boys to track and hunt, skills they desperately needed in this country. He began to teach Alara to read using an old, worn Bible, recognizing the sharpness of her mind. Sarah, in turn, managed the household efficiently. The garden thrived under her care. She learned to preserve food, to stretch their supplies. She mended Elias's worn clothes, cooked nourishing meals that filled his Spartan table with simple abundance. A partnership, unspoken and unconventional, had formed. It wasn't a marriage, not in the eyes of the world or the law. It was something born of strange circumstances and mutual necessity, a shared commitment to survival on this isolated patch of land. The children, initially wary, now saw Elias not as an owner, but a quiet protector. They still gave him space, but the youngest didn't cry when he was near, and the older ones sought his silent approval. He never demanded affection, but he responded to their tentative steps towards him with small, consistent acts of care. News of Elias Thorne and his peculiar household eventually filtered back to the nearest settlement, carried by infrequent travelers or those who saw smoke from his chimney. Whispers started. Thorne's gone soft. Bought himself a ready-made family. Against nature, isn't it? Not all the attention was just talk. One harsh winter, supplies ran dangerously low. Elias had to make a long, risky trip to town. While he was gone, a group of men, led by a particularly unpleasant individual who had been at the auction and resented Thorne's odd purchase, rode up to the cabin. They claimed they were concerned about the children's welfare, but their eyes held greed and malice. They saw 13 souls, a pregnant widow. They didn't know the baby had been born, ripe for taking, for being split up and used for labor elsewhere. Sarah faced them alone, Daniel wrapped tight against her chest, her other children gathered behind her, their small faces mirroring her fear, yet showing a newfound defiance born of their time here. "He ain't here, widow?" the leader sneered, dismounting. "Maybe you oughta come back with us. The town'll take care of you. These kids can be placed proper." His implication was clear. Separation, a return to the auction block, but piecemeal this time. Sarah's heart pounded, but she stood taller than she had in years. The desolation of the auction square had been replaced by the solid ground of her own resilience, nurtured by the quiet stability Elias had provided. This place, this cabin, was their haven, paid for in fear and uncertainty, built on quiet trust and shared struggle. She wasn't the broken woman they had bought. "This is our home," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly but clear. "Mr. Thorne bought us fair and square. We are under his protection." The men laughed. "Thorne? That hermit?" He won't know what happened out here. Just then, a figure appeared on the ridge, a solitary horseman etched against the pale winter sky. Elias. He rode down quickly, his expression grim as he took in the scene. The unwelcome men. Sarah standing protectively in front of her children. He dismounted, his rifle held loosely but purposefully. He didn't speak, didn't shout threats. His mere presence, quiet and unwavering, filled the small clearing with a palpable tension. The leader of the group exchanged nervous glances with his men. Thorn had a reputation for being quiet, but capable and fiercely independent. They were not prepared for a fight, especially not over people they considered worthless. Elias stood between Sarah and the unwelcome riders, his rifle a silent promise. He said nothing, his gaze moving slowly from one man to the next. The air thickened with unspoken confrontation. The leader, sensing the shift in the balance, the unexpected solid ground beneath Sarah's defiance and Thorn's quiet presence, spat on the ground. "All right, Thorn," he grumbled, mounting his horse. "Just checking on things. Town hears stories." He didn't look at Sarah. "Ride on." The men left, their bravado evaporating in the face of Thorn's stillness. Only when they were gone, disappearing over the ridge, did the tension ease. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The children, who had been a silent, terrified huddle behind her, began to stir, relief washing over their faces. Elias turned to Sarah. For the first time, his expression was not unreadable. There was acknowledgement, respect, something akin to pride in his eyes as he looked at her, at the circle of children she had protected. He looked at Daniel in her arms. He didn't offer words of comfort, but his presence, his quiet defense of them, was a language Sarah understood perfectly now. It spoke of commitment, of belonging. He had bought them, yes, but he had also chosen them, and in doing so had been chosen in return. The incident, when word of it inevitably reached the settlement, did indeed stun the West. Not the attempted intimidation, that was common enough, but the outcome. That the reclusive Elias Thorn had not only taken on the burden of a pregnant widow and 12 children, kept them together, and defended them against those who sought to scatter or exploit them. It defied the narrative of the harsh, individualistic frontier, the expectation that such a burden would be shed or broken. It wasn't about wealth or societal standing. It was about an unexpected, unconventional bond. The years that followed solidified this truth. Their lives remained hard, marked by the endless labor of carving existence from the land. But they faced it together. Sarah, no longer the despairing widow, became a woman of immense strength, managing their home, contributing equally to their survival. The children thrived under her care and Thorn's quiet guidance, growing into capable young people. Elias Thorn, the silent, solitary man, was no longer alone. His life was filled with the noise and chaos of a large family, a reality he had seemingly embraced, not endured. He never spoke of why he had bid that day, never explained the $50. But Sarah stopped needing to know. The why was less important than the how they had built a life together, piece by painful piece, out of the ashes of her past and the mystery of his. Their relationship wasn't defined by legal papers or societal norms, but by shared sunrises and brutal winters, by quiet suppers and the laughter of children, by mutual respect and an unspoken love that had grown in the barren ground of necessity. Sarah had been bought at auction, a symbol of her utter powerlessness. But in the cabin in the valley, she had found her strength, not given but earned. She was no longer property. She was the heart of a home built on resilience and the unexpected kindness of a solitary man. Their story became a quiet legend in the territory, a testament to the fact that even in the harshest places, dignity could be reclaimed, and family could be found in the most improbable ways, proving that the human spirit, like a hardy prairie flower, could bloom even in the dust.